And I said, he was a stickler for perfection.
Yes.
And don't forget, now we were the first African American group to do what we did.
Right. Groundbreaking.
So we didn't really have a lot of room for personal flaws.
Verdine White has allegedly been keeping a secret about Earth, Wind, and Fire for years. But now, the truth is finally coming out, and it changes everything we thought we knew about the legendary band.
So it was a great learning experience.
Verdine White, the flashy, ever-smiling bassist who kept the groove alive, has seen it all. The success, the struggles, the loss. But there are parts of the band's story that have been kept in the shadows. Why did some of the original members leave so suddenly? What really happened to Don Myrick? And why were there so many money issues, even when the band was making millions?
We had to make a decision. Could we go on without Maurice? Would the audiences accept us without Maurice? So the three of us.
Earth, Wind, and Fire wasn't just a band. They were a feeling. Their music made you feel good, made you feel alive. But behind all the smooth harmonies and legendary horn sections, there were moments of heartbreak, loss, and bitter disputes. Maurice White, the mastermind behind the group, had a vision bigger than just making hit records. He wanted to create a sound that changed the world. And he did. But the price of that success? It cost friendships. It cost trust. It even cost some of the members their lives. And the one person who was there through it all? Verdine White.
And I was glad to be one of the cats. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
I wasn't one of the cats yet, but I was around.
By the late 1970s, Earth, Wind, and Fire was at the top of the world. Literally. They weren't just making hit records, they were redefining what a band could be. Their music was a perfect blend of funk, soul, jazz, and even rock, wrapped up in deep spiritual themes and electrifying stage shows. Audiences couldn't get enough. Every album went platinum. Every tour sold out. The awards just kept piling up. But behind all that success, tensions were brewing. One of the biggest issues: who really deserved credit for Earth, Wind, and Fire's sound? Maurice White was the visionary. He built the band from the ground up, crafting their image and overall musical direction. But while Maurice was the leader, he wasn't doing it alone. The band had some incredibly talented members who played major roles in writing and shaping the music. And one of the most important? Guitarist Al McKay.
Hi, I'm Al McKay for Starlix.
McKay wasn't just another musician. He was one of the band's key songwriters. He helped create some of their biggest hits, including the legendary September. But as the band got bigger, McKay started feeling like he wasn't getting the recognition he deserved. Maurice White was the face of Earth, Wind, and Fire. And in the public eye, he got most of the credit. That didn't sit right with McKay. He felt like his work was just as important, but he wasn't getting his fair share of the credit or the money. By 1980, the tension had reached a breaking point. McKay walked away from Earth, Wind, and Fire, citing creative differences. But behind the scenes, it was more than just artistic disagreements. It was about respect, recognition, and compensation.
This one is, this is my baby, and I love this band. So I'm real happy where I am.
McKay's departure was just the beginning of the band's struggles. Losing McKay meant losing one of the core architects of their sound. And it wasn't long before other problems started creeping in. For one, the band had been going non-stop for years. The pressure to keep churning out hits and touring the world was exhausting. Maurice White, in particular, was feeling the weight of it all. He was the leader, the decision-maker, the one keeping everything together. And that kind of stress, it starts to take a toll. To make matters worse, the music industry itself was changing. The early 80s saw the rise of synthesizers, drum machines, and a shift in popular music trends: funk and soul, Earth, Wind, and Fire's signature sound. were starting to take a back seat to the slick electronic sounds of new wave and synth pop. The band tried to adapt, but it wasn't easy. And then came another devastating blow: Maurice White's health. Unbeknownst to fans at the time, Maurice was starting to struggle with Parkinson's disease. The symptoms weren't overwhelming yet, but they were enough to make performing and running the band harder and harder. So by the early 80s, Earth, Wind & Fire wasn't just facing external pressures. They were fighting battles from within. Al McKay leaving was a red flag, but no one realized at the time that it marked the beginning of a slow decline. The band would continue making music, but something had changed. The magic, the unity, the unstoppable momentum they had in the 70s, it was starting to slip away. And for Maurice White, the struggles were just getting started. When people talk about Earth, Wind & Fire's signature sound, they often mention the powerhouse vocals, the funky rhythms, or the electrifying horn section. But there's one instrument that always stood out in their music: the saxophone. And one man was responsible for some of the most iconic sax solos in the band's history: Don Myrick. If you've ever heard Reasons, then you know exactly why Myrick was special. That haunting, emotional sax solo? That was him. His playing wasn't just technically brilliant, it had soul, it had pain, it had feeling. He could make his instrument cry, scream, and sing, and fans felt every note. But behind the music, Don Myrick's life wasn't always glamorous. Like a lot of musicians who came up in the 70s and 80s, Don struggled with addiction. The music industry was filled with temptation: drugs, fast money, and the pressure to keep up with an exhausting lifestyle. Touring non-stop, partying hard, and dealing with the ups and downs of fame took a toll on him. And as the years went by, Myrick's struggles started affecting his career. By the time the 80s rolled around, Earth, Wind & Fire was going through major changes. Some of the key members, including guitarist Al McKay, had left the group. Maurice White was battling health issues, and the band was feeling the pressure to stay relevant in a changing music industry. Myrick's personal struggles only made things harder. He drifted from the band, and his career began to slow down. He still played music, but it wasn't the same. The industry moves fast, and if you're not on top, it's easy to get left behind. Then came '93, the year everything came to a devastating end. On July 30th, 1993, Don Myrick was at his home in Los Angeles when police raided his apartment. The official report? Officers were searching for drugs. But what happened next is still debated to this day. According to the police, Don made a suspicious move, and in the heat of the moment, they opened fire. He was shot once in the chest and died at just 53 years old. No drugs were ever found. For a lot of people, something about the situation never sat right. Why was Myrick targeted in the first place? If no drugs were found, was the raid even justified? And most importantly, was deadly force really necessary? To this day, some believe Don Myrick was already in a downward spiral, financially, mentally, and emotionally. He had been struggling for years, and many wonder if things could have been different if he had gotten more support earlier on. Maurice White was more than just the frontman of Earth, Wind & Fire. He was the band's heartbeat, its guiding force, and the architect behind its groundbreaking sound. He wasn't just a singer, he was a producer, a songwriter, and a visionary who blended soul, funk, jazz, and African rhythms into something entirely new. Under his leadership, the band didn't just create music, they created experiences, layering harmonies, complex rhythms, and deeply spiritual messages into every song. But while the world saw him as a powerhouse on stage, few knew that behind the scenes, he was fighting a battle he could never win. The first signs of trouble appeared in the early 1980s. Maurice, always so in control, started to notice small changes in his body. They were barely noticeable, a slight tremor in his hands, a stiffness when he played an instrument. At first, he brushed it off, assuming it was fatigue from constant touring and performing. After all, Earth, Wind & Fire was at the height of its success, and slowing down was not an option. But as time passed, the symptoms became harder to ignore. His hands shook more often, and even simple movements, like directing the band or playing the kalimba, his signature African thumb piano, became difficult. His voice, once so rich and commanding, began to lose its steadiness. Something was wrong. He sought medical advice, and after a series of tests, he received the diagnosis: Parkinson's disease. At the time, Parkinson's wasn't widely understood, but one thing was clear: it was progressive, meaning it would only get worse. For a man whose entire identity was wrapped around music, performance, and control, the news was devastating. But Maurice was not the type to show weakness. He made a decision that would define the next phase of his life. He would keep it a secret. He refused to let his illness overshadow the band's success or change how people viewed him. He didn't want pity, and he certainly didn't want Earth, Wind & Fire's legacy to be tainted by his personal struggles. So he carried on as if nothing was wrong. He hid his symptoms from the public, from the media, and even from many of his own bandmates. He adapted, finding ways to minimize the tremors, adjusting his performance style, and letting others take on more of the physical demands of touring. But as much as he tried to fight it, Parkinson's was relentless. By the early 1990s, Maurice could no longer ignore the inevitable. The disease had progressed to the point where performing was no longer an option. His movements were too restricted, his voice too inconsistent. He had to step back from the stage.
We had to make a decision. Could we go on without Maurice? Would the audiences accept us without Maurice? So the three of us took it forward.
This marked a major turning point for Earth, Wind & Fire. Maurice had always been the band's leader, both musically and spiritually. With him stepping away, the question became, who would take his place? That role eventually fell to his younger brother, Verdine White, the band's bassist and longtime key member. Verdine had always been an essential part of Earth, Wind & Fire's sound and energy. But now he had to step up in ways he never had before. He took on a greater leadership role, ensuring that the band continued to thrive even without Maurice at the forefront. But this transition wasn't without controversy. Longtime fans wondered if the band could truly be the same without Maurice. Some saw Verdine's leadership as an extension of Maurice's vision, a way to keep his legacy alive. Others questioned whether Earth, Wind & Fire could maintain its soul without the man who had built it from the ground up.
And you don't forget now, that hole he had was huge. So we had to really put it together, which we did.
Regardless, the band pressed on, continuing to tour and release music, with Maurice contributing behind the scenes as much as he could. Though he could no longer perform, he remained involved in production, songwriting, and mentoring younger musicians, determined to keep the essence of Earth, Wind & Fire alive. Maurice White's battle with Parkinson's lasted more than 3 decades, a slow, painful struggle that took him further and further away from the music he loved. He passed away in 2016, leaving behind an untouchable legacy.
Maurice White, the founder of the US soul group Earth, Wind & Fire, has died. He was 74.
For a band as big as Earth, Wind & Fire, you'd think everyone would be set for life, right? Well, not exactly. Earth, Wind & Fire was one of the biggest bands of all time, selling millions of records and filling arenas around the world. With that level of success, you'd think every member was set for life. But as it turns out, money problems haunted the band for decades, long after their peak in the 70s and 80s. Even though they had chart-topping hits, platinum albums, and legendary performances, financial issues were always lurking in the background. The biggest problem? Unpaid royalties. And in 2012, The issue finally exploded when the family of Charles Stepney, one of the key producers behind their sound, filed a lawsuit claiming he never received the money he was owed.
He was the one that Maurice respected. He was the one that could write it, arrange it, play it, show us how to sing it, and tell us when it's wrong.
Stepney wasn't just any producer. He was a crucial part of Earth, Wind & Fire's early success. Maurice White always credited Stepney as a co-architect of their unique fusion of soul, jazz, and funk. Stepney helped shape the lush orchestral arrangements that made their music stand out, producing tracks that became legendary. But despite his impact, Stepney passed away in 1976 without seeing the full financial benefits of his work with the band. His family claimed that for decades, they had been denied royalties that should have rightfully gone to them. The lawsuit brought to light deeper issues about how the band's money was handled over the years. If someone as important as Stepney hadn't been paid properly, how many others had been shortchanged? This lawsuit wasn't just about Stepney's royalties. It opened the floodgates to long-standing tensions about Earth, Wind & Fire's finances. As one of the few remaining original members still active in the band, Verdine White found himself at the center of the controversy. Maurice had always been the leader, the visionary, the one who guided the band's creative and business decisions. But after Parkinson's forced him to step away, Verdine took on more responsibility. That meant dealing with both the band's legacy and its money issues. Naturally, people started asking, how much did Verdine know about where all the money was going? But this wasn't the first time money issues had surfaced in the band's history. Over the years, there were whispers about financial disputes, lawsuits, and behind-the-scenes struggles over royalties. Some members had left the band under unclear circumstances, and in the music business, that often meant money was involved. During the 1970s, Earth, Wind & Fire was at the peak of its success, dominating the charts with hit after hit. But behind the scenes, there were growing concerns about financial mismanagement that would eventually create serious problems for the band. One of the biggest issues was extravagant spending. As the band's fame skyrocketed, so did their expenses. Elaborate stage productions, flashy costumes, and high-end recording sessions all added up. Maurice White, the band's leader, had a grand vision for Earth, Wind & Fire that went beyond just making music. He wanted to build an empire, which included launching his own record label imprint and constructing a massive studio complex where the band could produce their music independently.
From another sense, it came from a part of me wanting to render itself to humanity. That's why we have the message music and the whole thing of associating us with spirituality.
While these ideas were ambitious, they also put a heavy financial strain on the group's resources. One of the key reasons for the financial troubles was the lack of proper oversight. In many cases, musicians trust business managers and accountants to handle money matters, but without strict supervision, things can spiral out of control. The music industry in the 1970s was notorious for artists being underpaid, misled, or outright cheated out of their earnings. While Earth, Wind & Fire was making millions from album sales, touring, and merchandising, it wasn't always clear where all that money was going. Reports surfaced that the band's finances were in trouble despite their commercial success. Some members later admitted that they weren't fully aware of how their earnings were being handled, which led to serious tensions within the group. Maurice White's passion for expanding Earth, Wind & Fire into more than just a band was admirable, but it may have contributed to the financial difficulties. He invested heavily in his Kalimba Productions label, hoping to discover and produce new talent. But running a label is a costly business, especially when managing a band as large as Earth, Wind & Fire.
Basically, we're a jazz band, and we converted a jazz band into a pop band, so it covers all areas.
By the late 1970s, these financial strains became more apparent. Although the band continued to sell records and perform sold-out shows, Behind the scenes, money troubles were mounting. The combination of extravagant spending, poor financial management, and risky business ventures created a situation where even one of the biggest bands in the world wasn't immune to money problems. Ultimately, these financial difficulties would set the stage for internal conflicts that would carry over into the 1980s, affecting both the band's creative direction and its lineup. As Earth, Wind & Fire moved into the 1980s, the band faced a new kind of challenge: creative disagreements. Throughout the 1970s, their signature blend of funk, soul, and jazz had made them one of the most successful and influential groups of their era. However, as musical trends shifted in the 1980s, with the rise of synth pop, electronic music, and new wave, the band found itself at a crossroads. Some members wanted to stick to the sound that had made them famous, while others, including Maurice White, were interested in experimenting with new styles. One of the most significant moments of creative tension came when guitarist and songwriter Al McKay left the band. McKay had played a huge role in shaping Earth, Wind & Fire's signature sound, co-writing some of their biggest hits like September and Sing a Song. His departure was a major blow, and it signaled deeper issues within the group. McKay reportedly disagreed with the band's direction, particularly Maurice White's increasing interest in incorporating electronic and synth-heavy elements into their music. The biggest controversy came in 1983 with the release of the album Electric Universe. This album was a drastic departure from the band's classic sound, leaning heavily into synth-driven production that mirrored the electronic music trends of the time. While Maurice White saw it as a necessary evolution, other members, and many fans, felt it strayed too far from what made Earth, Wind & Fire unique. The album was met with criticism, and commercially, it underperformed compared to their past successes. Some former members were vocal about their disappointment, arguing that the band was losing its identity. The fallout from Electric Universe was significant. Following its release, Earth, Wind & Fire went on hiatus, marking the first major break in their career. Maurice White eventually pursued solo projects, but tensions over the band's sound and direction lingered. When the band reunited later in the decade, they attempted to strike a balance between modernizing their music while staying true to their roots. However, the creative disputes of the 1980s had already taken a toll. Many original members had moved on, and while Earth, Wind & Fire remained a respected and legendary group, the internal struggles over their musical direction left a lasting impact. By the 1990s, Earth, Wind & Fire had cemented their legacy as one of the most influential bands in music history.
Well, the first thing I can say is that I'm speechless for getting this together. But it's been a long, hard road, but it's been a beautiful road, having the talented musicians along with us to take the ride.
Their songs had become timeless classics, and with the rise of hip-hop and electronic music, many new artists were sampling their work. However, this led to a new battle: unauthorized sampling and legal disputes. Sampling, the practice of taking a portion of a song and reusing it in another, became a major part of hip-hop and dance music culture in the 1990s. While some artists obtained permission and paid royalties, many did not. As a result, Earth, Wind & Fire found themselves fighting to protect their intellectual property. One of the most notable cases involved the Italian dance group Black Box, who had built their music around sampled vocals and instrumental loops. In 1990, Black Box faced lawsuits for using unlicensed vocals from Loliata Holloway, a singer whose voice had been heavily sampled in dance music. Since some of her vocals were tied to songs connected with Earth, Wind & Fire's influence, this case brought more attention to the issue of unauthorized sampling. Maurice White and the remaining members of Earth, Wind & Fire were not against sampling in principle. In fact, they understood that their music had influenced a new generation of artists. However, they were firm about ensuring that they were properly credited and compensated. Many legendary artists, especially black musicians from the 1970s, had faced situations where their work was used without acknowledgement or payment. Earth, Wind & Fire was determined not to let that happen. The lawsuits of the 1990s helped set a precedent for music rights and intellectual property in the digital age. Artists were increasingly taking legal action to claim ownership of their work, leading to stricter copyright enforcement in the industry. As a result, future musicians had to navigate more complex licensing agreements when sampling classic tracks. At the end of the day, Earth, Wind & Fire's music will always be legendary. That's never gonna change. But when you look at everything that happened behind the scenes, the lawsuits, the members who left, the financial struggles, the tragic losses, it makes you wonder, did it all have to go down this way? Could some of these guys have been helped before things got too far? Could some of these friendships have been saved? And what role did Verdine really play in all of this? One thing's for sure, this story is a lot deeper than just the music. Anyway, that's it for this video, folks. Bye.